My name is Michael Gaia, publisher of the Lead Lag Report, as well as there with Mr. Matthew Ball, who some of you may have seen doing the media rounds over the years. I think, Matt, you were on CBC not too long ago. For those who are not familiar with you, introduce yourself. Who are you? What's your background? What have you done throughout your career? What are you doing currently?
Thanks for the introduction. Really excited to be here. I've held a number of different roles. I was a management consultant in the 2000s after a shorter stint in private equity and investment banking, focusing primarily in oil and gas and energy. But at that time, it was very much focused on what was then advanced simulation. And in the 2 decades since, I focused in the mobile app economy, consumer media. I was the head of strategy for Amazon Studios, which at the time ran most of Prime Video. Subsequent to that, started my own holdco opco, where we build, buy, develop, scale a number of different businesses, as well as produce TV series, films, and video games. For the most part, my business these days is focused on interactive product. That is sometimes B2B, real-time 3D simulation software, other times more consumer-facing products. Broadly, lumped together as the Metaverse.
Okay, I know you put out a book touching on Metaverse and how it will revolutionize everything. That's the subtitle. Take us back to the kind of mini hype mania cycle that happened about 2 years ago. I myself was joking about the Metaverse in terms of some of the initial visuals that you would see. It looks almost like Wii Sports. Remember that from the early 2000 period,
Yeah.
right? And there was a lot of hype. There's a lot of investment dollars that flowed and then kind of went round trip. Talk through what happened in the last 2 years in terms of what people got right back then and what they maybe are getting wrong now.
That's a great place to start. So look, the term metaverse, as most people know, is 30 years old, stems from a 1992 novel. Since that novel was published, we've really gone through 2 prior hype cycles leading to today. There was one in the late 90s, another that primarily followed Second Life, which actually predates MySpace, if you can believe it. And then we hit this one in 2021, but really started in the fourth quarter of 2020. That's when Roblox filed their S1, wrote that they were in the emergent metaverse category, which they believed was coming to fruition. At that time, Roblox's S1, there have been fewer than 24 total mentions in an SEC filing of the term metaverse from 92 through to 2020. In 2021, that sum jumped to 265 in year. In 2022, we had 2,900. And this year, we're likely to hit between 3,000 and 3,500, actually still up year over year. But what's critical is to recognize that this idea is much older than that. It actually spans close to a century. When we get into the early 1930s, pioneers in computer science and computer logic in the 1950s with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the field of science fiction itself starts to document immersive virtual reality, AI and virtual reality nurseries, a world that is not altogether dissimilar from the pandemic. Isaac Asimov writes a novel about what he calls physical distancing, a world where all communication, most work, happens from remote distances through projection. In the 1950s, we get further development of that. We then get into the early 1980s, where the field of philosophy starts to contest with this growing observation that more and more of our lives, yet still on the fringes, are simulated, are reflected in synthetic reality. By 1984, we have the William Gibson novel that coins the term matrix in cyberspace. And so these ideas have been echoing for centuries. What happened over the last decade, leading up to 2021, was not just the growing popularity of virtual worlds, not just growth in how many people are in them, how often, how much they spend, the cultural relevance, their capability, but fundamental advances on the deployment of these technologies in other fields. 2 of the most important advances relate to the detail available in a simulation and its determinism. I'll take a step back. It was really in the last decade that we could do more than rudimentary simulation of fire, good enough for Space Invaders or Donkey Kong or Call of Duty, but get down to particle physics and simulation, heat, energy, sound, vibration. Accordant with that was also a shift to deterministic simulation in real time. That is to say that every time you ran these simulations, you would get the same answer rather than one that was statistically bound in a set of probabilities. By the end of this last decade, there was growing consensus that we were starting to reach some critical transformation, not unlike the 2000s when you had the iPhone, 4G, app stores, Android come out in rapid succession. The challenge when we talk about this hype cycle is looking forward. When Mark Zuckerberg changed the name of his company, he was very clear saying that he believed that within 5 to 10 years, the metaverse would start to formalize. Others, such as Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, who has said that he believes that more than half of the world economy will exist in the metaverse, talked about it as a multi-decades diffuse transformation. But then you had Satya Nadella say the metaverse is here. Bill Gates said that within 3 years, 3/4 of calls would be in the metaverse. The crypto craze took off, closely associated with that theme, with a different perspective. The metaverse was here. It's actually been here for years, but now it's ready for prime time. And so all of a sudden, this long-running theme, very specific technological progress, rushed into now. And no matter how much Mark Zuckerberg had articulated, it was not ready. Changing the name of the seventh most valuable company in such a manner also elevated those expectations. So then we hit the crash. 2 years later, a number of people, quite fairly and rightly, said, my life is too different. I don't see the metaverse revenues on a P&L. I can't even think of what products I can buy that are quote unquote metaverse. And so then we get to the point of disillusionment we sit in today.
And it takes time for that disillusionment to really fade away, right? That's kind of the issue with historically when you look at bubbles, we can debate whether it was a mini bubble or not. When you had these types of hype cycles, you need quite a bit of time to pass for there to be belief that ends up being what the original thought process would be as far as how it turns out.
I think that's quite right. I think in this instance, it's very likely that the term is shed altogether. It has become so strongly associated with one company so focused on virtual reality, which is a potential way to access the metaverse, a company that is not widely beloved and which sits in contrast to a series of other companies such as Apple, which are embracing other terms, ignoring them altogether, and instead leading with product and experience, right? Apple is the best example. They are clear to say that this is the era of spatial computing. Tim Cook has raised expectations as much as he can, but the focus is very much on the product, on the experience, rather than this relatively abstract theme. Moreover, we have the thousands of retail stores through which Apple is going to be able to show off this hardware and this experience. The consensus among many in the quote-unquote metaverse community is that the future of the metaverse is to be called spatial. Actually, that term comes from 1993, a year after metaverse. Or more likely, the internet, but in 3D, if not the internet outright. We will just think of it as an enhancement rather than something wholly discrete.
Is it fair to say that Apple really is sort of the company that has to turn perceptions around? If anybody can do it, it's Apple, and there's really no one else that can, shorten that time frame around what people thought the metaverse would be, and then the kind of disappointment over the last 2 years.
I think it's an interesting question that depends on exactly what you're narrowing in on. And by that, I mean, Roblox is as close to the consumer side expression of the metaverse as any company right now. It has about 350 million or 315 million monthly active users. They're now at close to 70 million daily active users. It's a platform of roughly 70 million, all interconnected, seamlessly integrated worlds with a consistent identity, communication suite, asset formats, broad interop, avatars, commerce, and so forth. And it's doing about 4.5 to 5 billion hours of entertainment. It actually sits in contrast to nearly every other pandemic darling and the gaming industry at large, as you kindly put into the Spaces thread, in that, unlike Zoom, Shopify, Peloton, it didn't pull back in any regard post-pandemic. It has continued to grow. It has grown 20% year over year. It's more than twice the size it was in the first quarter of the pandemic. That is proselytizing a much younger generation because every year there's roughly 140 million people who turn 9 at that demo. That cohort does not need Apple, nor do they need Meta. But when you're talking about the HMD or head-mounted display, what we call virtual reality headsets or goggles, augmented reality, mixed reality, extended reality, Apple does seem for the foreseeable future to be the company which is best positioned to show off why everyone in big tech considers these devices the future, the best way to navigate 3D space. Not least of which stems from the fact that their bill of materials is about $2,500 to $2,500. In other words, the pure cost for Apple, whose dollar performance already exceeds that of the rest of the industry, which benefits from extraordinary economies of scale, not to mention extraordinary industrial design sensibility. The cost of their HMD to build is still roughly 8 to 9 times as much as Meta's device. That mixed with their ecosystem, their brand, their retail, their education, plus their sensibilities, it's certainly fair to say that they have the best near-term shot of proving what this is and why it warrants so much attention. Sure. So a few different things are true. Number one, Horizon World, which is Meta's virtual world platform, is in many ways one of the strangest things that I have seen when it comes to some sort of new computing or social wave. In the sense that it is super high profile alongside Sandbox or Decentraland, which are often talked about from the press, but they are probably between the 7th, if not 40th or more, most popular version of that same expression. We know that Horizon World is running at between 100 and 200,000 MAUs, many of which just stem naturally from the use of the Quest platform, which has roughly 7 million monthly active users. But to put that in perspective, there's roughly 6.5 million people joining Roblox every hour. And so roughly every few minutes, more people log on to Roblox, or for that matter, Minecraft, than Horizon Worlds in a month. When you take a look at Rec Room, another VR native version of Horizon Worlds, or VR Chat, these are startups that have between 25 and 400 employees and are themselves hundreds of times larger than Horizon Worlds. Sandbox has not given detailed statistics, but we know that in 2022, they were at roughly 200,000 monthly active users. I believe they said 57 or 40,000 daily active users, many of whom are reportedly not logging in to engage with the platform, but instead to buy and sell as part of trading activity. Decentraland is in the tens of thousands of monthly active users. And so again, in contrast to platforms with tens of millions of DAO, or a Fortnite, which is sitting at millions of DAO, they're quite small. And so if anything, I think there's a fundamental problem which is ever focusing on the distant laggards in contrast to the market leaders. Now, your question of what's going to happen to them is, at least in my perspective, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts, largely immaterial in the sense that we are talking so distant-tailed that many will perish, some might be rolled up and merged, yet it's not entirely clear, even if we skip over the technical difficulties of integration, what the benefits will be. You have 10 platforms, each with a few thousand MAUs. A roll-up is both intuitive and yet solves very little. And so exactly what happens there is harder for me to predict. I'm less sure that there's going to be something consequential. Before passing it back over to you, Philip, and it's really nice to hear you call in, there's kind of this one big bogey that everyone has. Thus far, the argument for crypto-native virtual world platforms is that they will be so much more economically efficient, that they will attract much more developer investment due to the upside economics, that they will outpace Web 2 platforms. That hasn't happened. But in early next year, Krafton, which is the maker of PUBG, one of the biggest games in history. At their peak, they had 160 million daily active users, much larger than Fortnite or Call of Duty. They've announced that they're going to be launching, in partnership with Naver, the South Korean giant, their own crypto-based virtual world platform. In the context of their overall expertise in history in gaming, plus their national relevance in South Korea in particular, and the rest of their business assets, which they will use to flow users in. That is probably the big what if to come.
Yeah, Phil, it's hard. That's another I just want to keep it tight to the half hour. But I think it's an interesting point. But that does bring it with it two questions I want to go with. Just get your take on this, Matt. And at some point, Philip, maybe you and I can do a space separately. I'll be here with your thoughts broader on that. Two things. One, you mentioned economically efficient. Now, this is not an area I know much about, but given your prior experience when it comes to oil, gas, and energy, I'm going to assume that any kind of longer term vision around metaverse economic efficiency obviously will relate to the input of energy costs. How does the price of energy factor into metaverse adoption and sort of a broader consumer adoption there?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and we see this in a few different ways. There are a bunch of reports over the week of both the energy-related costs of generative AI to begin with, as well as some of the supporting systems around that. That is to say, the difference between just running the lights on a data center and then specifically answering a query. All of them are much greater for the metaverse, partly because we're talking about a real-time system rather than the response to queries, which are generated continuously while they're being responded, but you're not in a process of every single second sending out a transaction or ping to these systems. There are a bunch of different hypotheses as to how complex the energy use requirements are going to be. I'll tell you that in general, when I hear these concerns and when I've had conversations about them, there's actually a broader concern about the environmental impact of just broadband and high capacity fiber implementation around the world, especially as you expand to more rural areas. We see this with the many, many submarine cables that are being laid right now. Those environmental concerns actually seem far greater than the electricity and attendant environmental concerns, but they're just as valid, certainly.
What about potential for sort of a legal challenge to, over time, the metaverse sort of taking over more and more aspects of our lives? I've joked before that we've gotten to a point where people are giving up their Bill of Rights in favor of terms of service. Right? I've got to assume that becomes problematic at scale. I can see that partially with data privacy when it comes to social media networks, but it seems like there's much more complicating dynamics when it comes to the metaverse in general.
It's quite right. Look, there's a bunch of different things that one can say to be histrionic or to inflame response, but at the end of the day, most of them are true. And let me give you an example. We have very quickly accommodated to the idea that our devices are listening to us. There was controversy when the Xbox came out or the Xbox One came out in 2013, I think. And you could just say something like Xbox turn off. And that was creepy. People hated it. And so Microsoft ultimately shipped a turn off function. Well, a decade later, none of us bat an eyelash about the number of devices in and around us in private and in public that are listening for a passive keyword trigger. And there's concerns about that. The positive thing is that most of those devices are locally processing that information. Hey Siri does not require the pinging of a remote, let alone extra sovereign data center to answer whether or not you asked the appropriate keyword. But when we're talking about HMDs, we are talking about seeing everything around you. It is a map of your home, necessary for some games, if just to prevent you from stumbling over a coffee table. It will see your tax returns on the table. It will see your child running nude through the living room as they do and as they should when they see fit and as they're growing up. And so there are all of these different, very significant privacy-related concerns. The challenge here is, of course, we have poor laws around data. We have poor data literacy, poor data security, poor data rights. All of those will become harder, more intensified. And the answer is complicated. There is a difference between data which is processed locally, data which is processed remotely, but within the servers of the hardware manufacturer. There's a difference when that data is being sent to a third-party server. There's a difference when that data is being sent to a third-party server within your local jurisdiction and without. And then there's further challenges when it comes to which data is being sent. Biometric data, eye tracking that has the perception of your retina versus eye tracking that just sees your pupil moving around. We don't have a good framework for that. We don't have a good personal understanding of them, and they're going to be important. There are some interesting carve-outs around that I think are important to understand and generally misunderstood. Epic Games, which makes the Unreal Engine, is a good example. A few years ago, they voluntarily changed their user agreement, their developer licensing agreement, in a really important way. And that was to recognize that in the event of a dispute between them and a licensee, they were waiving their right to terminate the license, even if that licensee was not paying their royalties, that licensee was violating the terms of service, that licensee was even violating laws around the use of those technology, for example, terrorism. The purpose of that was not to wave their hands and just say it's going to be what it's going to be, but instead to provide existing legal frameworks and courts with the sole authority to adjudicate them. If Epic, for example, wants to say, Michael, you are being terminated from using the Unreal license, then Epic needs to get an injunction to do that. And that was a reflection of the fact that we are essentially talking about these simulation systems as running something akin to real estate or a floor. A landlord can't just show up and lock someone out of their place of doing business. They can't suspend your operations, and they can't just write in their contract, we have the right to do that. And so instead, we see some organizations, not all, that are taking processes to say, yes, existing legal frameworks are not sufficient. They were certainly not written for these operations in mind, but we can nevertheless use them in lieu of being judge, jury, executioner.
Matt, I know we're coming up with for those who want to track more of your thoughts and your work, obviously you've got your book. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. Available on Amazon, the Metaverse, how it will revolutionize everything. But where else would you point people to?
So you can go to matthewball.co.co and you'll find a number of my different essays. I'm on most platforms at Ball Matthew, BALLMATTHEW. I'll tell you just before I go, unfortunately, I have to attend to some family that's in town. But we started this conversation by talking about this multi-decade, if not century-long advance. And I'll tell you a fun story, which is the Unreal Engine gets its name from the first Unreal video game that came out in 1998. Before Mark Zuckerberg ever used the term in public, before Satya Nadella ever used the term in public, before Jensen Huang became a public advocate for it, Tim Sweeney, the founder, had put out a brief snippet of code from 1997. And this code was detailing the functionality that they had built into their title, designed to enable the metaverse. It was a decentralized network of user server operated virtual worlds that were created for any purpose, not just game, but broad socializing, if not commercial use cases. And Tim makes the point that that form of play or usage didn't last very long. And in hindsight, we can see why. Broadband speeds were too limited, familiarity with 3D space too inadequate, usage was tied to an immobile, expensive, not high-performant device, that is a desktop PC with a computer bus. At the time, Amazon had gone public, but very few people were comfortable putting their credit card into a web browser. Times have changed quite a bit. A substantial portion of that is just generational change. And so that's why we start to see things starting to change. And that's how we culminated it, which was their perspective was we have had metaverse ambitions for a long time, but only recently have we started to see enough of the working pieces formalized. And I'll tell you just as a sidebar, in 2020, Johns Hopkins performed the first ever live patient surgery using a mixed reality device in the US. That was the summer of 2020, spinal fusion surgery, followed by the removal of a cancerous tumor on a spinal column. As we sit here 3 years later, there have been more than 250 surgeries performed by that surgeon, in addition to hundreds more across the United States. When I started covering the metaverse, it was a term that was familiar to me among the many other substitutes since the 90s. Even in oil and gas, as we talked about laser ring gyros and trying to simulate the entire upstream and downstream usage of petroleum, refined or not, people were talking about these concepts. In 2018, I put out a relatively straightforward piece that was just saying, I'm starting to feel all of these pieces come together myself. And so the goal of my work and my book and my essays in this area have been to chart this. And I was positively advantaged by that timing. And then in April of next year, I'm going to re-release this book. 70% of it has been rewritten to reflect the enormity of the changes over the last 2 years, including the Apple Vision Pro headset. And so my departing thought as I bloviate on is just to say that as we sit here in 2023, it is obvious that the sentiment around the term metaverse has become sour or at least abated. But the potency of its underlying trend, the deployment of real-time simulation outside of games, the number of people using these spaces for leisure purposes, all of those are as strong as they have been since 1950 with the first computer games coming out of DARPA-associated facilities. And so I'm excited in how that's going to change in the years to come. I'm excited to see what the Apple Vision Pro does or doesn't do to sentiment, but I'm focused farther beyond that.
It's a good place to wrap this space up. Everybody, please make sure you follow the Bowl. Hopefully, we'll do a longer space in the future. Again, this will be an edited podcast under Lead Lag Live, and you'll see more of these spaces later in the week. Thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.